Milk, pure, essential, nourishing. Or is it? For most of us, milk brings to mind warmth, comfort, and care. It's one of the first things a newborn consumes, a symbol of innocence, of trust. But what if I told you that not too long ago, that very symbol became a silent killer? In 19th century New York City, a product as ordinary as milk was transformed into a deadly weapon. Not by chance, not by accident, but by deliberate human choice. Thousands of infants died, not from war or famine, but from a bottle handed to them in love and trust. In today's episode, we're going to uncover a horrifying but largely forgotten chapter of American history, the swill milk scandal, and explore how greed, neglect, and corruption poisoned the most vulnerable members of society, and how that tragedy helped shape the foundations of food safety we rely on today. To understand how such a scandal could even happen, we need to step back in time, to the 1850s, when New York City was rapidly becoming the bustling, chaotic center of a young, industrializing America. The streets were crowded. Immigrants arrived by the thousands each year, many fleeing poverty and famine in Europe, only to find themselves living in tiny tenement apartments with barely enough to eat. Public sanitation was nearly non-existent. Diseases like cholera, tuberculosis, and typhoid spread quickly in such tight quarters. For poor families, raising a baby was a daily battle. Many mothers worked long hours in factories or had poor health due to malnutrition. Breastfeeding wasn't always possible. And formula? It didn't exist yet. Milk, cow's milk, became the go-to solution for feeding infants. It was affordable, accessible, and perceived as natural and pure. But the reality was far from safe. There was no refrigeration in homes. Milk was transported in open containers, often warm and already beginning to spoil by the time it reached the neighborhood. There were no standardized inspections, no quality control, no labeling. People bought what they could afford and hoped for the best. At the same time, New York was also home to another booming industry: alcohol. Dozens of distilleries and breweries filled the city, producing rivers of beer and whiskey. These operations created a byproduct known as swill, hot, wet grain mash left over from brewing. Normally discarded, this swill found a second use: feeding dairy cows. It seemed like a smart way to reduce waste. Distillery owners built cow barns right next to their operations, feeding the animals a steady diet of swill to cut costs. But cows aren't meant to live off brewery waste. They became sickly, their teeth rotted, their bodies weakened, and yet they were milked daily. The milk from these diseased cows didn't just smell bad. It looked wrong, tasted foul. So what did producers do? They doctored it. They added chalk to whiten it, starch to thicken it, and even plaster of Paris to make it look fresh. And families, desperate and trusting, fed that milk to their children. Now that we understand the world these families lived in, let's dive into what went so horribly wrong with the milk they trusted. Let's walk into one of those distillery dairy barns. It's 1857. You're standing in a dim, foul-smelling structure crammed with cows. But these aren't the big, sturdy dairy cows you might picture grazing in a green pasture. These cows are sick, skeletal, covered in sores, barely able to stand. Their heads hang low, their stomachs are bloated, and their breath rasps with illness. They haven't seen grass in their lives. Why? Because they're not fed hay or grain. They're fed swill, hot, acidic waste left over from brewing alcohol, piped directly from the adjacent distillery into concrete troughs. It's steaming, sour, and bubbling. It smells awful, but it's cheap, and it's how these cows are kept alive, just barely. Despite their condition, they're milked every day. And that milk, it's barely milk. It's gray, watery, and slimy. It smells rotten, but it doesn't go to waste. In back rooms and milk houses, that gray liquid is transformed, not into something nutritious, but into something marketable. Workers add ingredients like chalk to make the color whiter. They add starch to thicken the texture. Plaster of Paris, yes, the same material used in walls, is added to give the milk body and visual appeal. Sometimes even molasses or ground eggshells were mixed in to mask the odor and taste. It was a chemical cocktail designed to trick the eye and tongue. The final product was bottled, labeled as pure country milk, and shipped across the city, especially to poor neighborhoods where families had no idea what they were feeding their children. At first, mothers didn't suspect the milk. How could they? Milk was supposed to be safe, but within weeks or months, babies began to grow ill. The symptoms were cruel. Infants developed severe diarrhea, vomiting, dehydration. Their skin grew pale, their tiny bodies shrank. Some developed mouth ulcers and infections so bad they couldn't eat. Many simply wasted away, from what physicians at the time vaguely called summer complaint or infantile cholera. It's estimated that over 8,000 infants died each year in New York City alone during this period, and many of those deaths were directly linked to swill milk. But the worst part? The city knew. Doctors suspected something was wrong. Parents pleaded for help. Even funeral homes quietly noted the pattern. Coffin after coffin, all babies under 2. And yet, the swill milk industry continued to thrive, protected by powerful friends and political influence. The man who would change everything wasn't a politician or a doctor. He was a journalist. In 1858, Frank Leslie, publisher of Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, began running stories about the swill dairies. His reporters went undercover into the distillery barns, sketching what they saw. They published illustrations of the emaciated cows and the filth in which they lived. One headline read, "Poisoned milk for our children, a public disgrace." The illustrations shocked the public. People who had been buying milk every day were suddenly faced with gruesome images of where that milk came from. Parents were horrified. Doctors demanded answers. But the milk producers weren't going down quietly. At the time, many of New York's milk businesses were closely tied to Tammany Hall, the powerful and notoriously corrupt Democratic political machine that controlled much of the city's government. These connections provided cover, and bribes ensured that health inspectors turned a blind eye. When reformers called for inspections, the city sent officials who were either incompetent or complicit. One inspector infamously declared that the swill-fed cows were not in bad condition, considering that they are cows. Yes, that was his actual defense. Still, the pressure was building. Doctors began conducting chemical tests on samples of swill milk and confirmed what the illustrations had shown. The milk was not only nutritionally void, it was toxic. Some even discovered trace amounts of ammonia and lead from the pipes used in the processing. Meanwhile, other journalists joined Leslie's crusade. Clergy preached against the evil of selling poison to babies. Women's groups mobilized, and community leaders began calling for public hearings. One of the most powerful testimonies came from Dr. James Hogan, a city physician who declared under oath, "The mortality among children fed upon the so-called milk is criminal. It is murder under the disguise of commerce." In response, the city finally convened a grand jury. It summoned dairy owners and distillers. Testimonies were taken. A law was drafted to regulate milk production, the first of its kind. But even then, change was slow. Despite all the evidence, the swill milk industry continued to operate for several more years, often in secret. The new regulations were weak and rarely enforced. It wasn't until years of public pressure and further exposés that the system finally began to crack. In 1862, New York passed a Milk Inspection Act, which laid the groundwork for modern food safety legislation. It mandated inspections of milk, punished adulteration, and, for the first time, acknowledged that what companies sold could kill. But for many families, the damage was already done. Entire generations of poor immigrants lost children they could not protect. Mothers blamed themselves, never knowing the truth. And to this day, the swill milk scandal remains a haunting example of how far greed can go and how long justice can take. So what happened when the public finally found out? Could something so horrifying go unpunished? In the next section, we'll explore how this tragedy shaped public health, food safety, and our very relationship with trust in what we consume. In the wake of public outcry, something began to shift. The horrifying images published by Frank Leslie's newspaper had done more than shock. They had mobilized. Public health advocates, reformers, and everyday citizens demanded answers. And finally, the city responded. In 1862, New York passed one of the earliest laws in the United States regulating milk production and inspection. It wasn't perfect. Enforcement was inconsistent, and corruption didn't vanish overnight, but it was a beginning. For the first time, the government acknowledged that food wasn't just a product. It was a matter of life and death. This scandal helped spark the earliest waves of what would become the consumer protection movement. It laid the groundwork for later reforms, including the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 and the eventual creation of the FDA. It taught Americans that without regulation, capitalism alone could be deadly, especially when the most vulnerable are the ones paying the price. And while this story is over 150 years old, its lessons remain painfully relevant today. In many developing countries, adulterated milk is still a serious problem, from powdered infant formula scandals in China to cases of contaminated baby food around the world. The conflict between profit and public safety is far from over. The swill milk scandal reminds us that greed can operate in silence, especially when the victims are too small, too poor, or too voiceless to fight back. It reminds us that clean, safe food doesn't just happen. It must be demanded, regulated, and defended. But beyond the regulations and courtrooms, there's one more thing we need to talk about: the legacy of grief and the courage of those who stood up. The swill milk scandal isn't just about milk, it's about trust. Trust in what we eat, trust in who we buy from, trust that someone, somewhere, is making sure the food we give our children won't kill them. And yet, history has shown us again and again that this trust can be broken, sometimes in the name of efficiency, often in the name of profit. So ask yourself, what would you have done if you were a mother in 1858, holding a bottle of milk in your hand, watching your baby grow weaker by the day? This story is a reminder that every protection we have today came from tragedy, from exposure, and from people who refused to stay silent. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you found this story meaningful, please share it, follow the podcast, and join me again next time for another hidden chapter of dark history.